So let's open up Visual Studio. And once it opens up, you'll want to make a new project for today. We'll choose the same options we've been using over the last few weeks. So we'll make a C# ASP.NET web application, and we'll make an empty application and choose web forms. So pick the same options we've picked in the past. Pick web, don't choose Visual Studio 2012. So I'll call mine COMP2084 lesson 4.
We're clicking new project, right?
Yep.
I don't have a list for a project on top. Where would I?
Control N.
Control F?
N.
N.
So I'm going to pick the empty template and what type we want folders for web forms. So empty up here at the top and make sure you check off web forms. Here.
Project.
Oh, it's Shift Control N. Sorry.
What's the difference between the web forms, like the tab and the button the web form at the bottom? There's a web form at the top that says empty.
Which one are we clicking when?
Well, the choice at the top is there's styles of projects. So there's an empty one, which is basically a blank canvas where there's nothing in it. So that's the one we picked. The web forms option, which we picked in week 1, it's where Visual Studio will build like 40 megs worth of stuff right into the project for us. Remember, it pre-built like a theme and included Bootstrap and jQuery and pre-built us a login and register. And then there was an MVC template, which is a different form of web application, which we may have a chance to play with. It's just a different structure. And the last one was a web API, so that's basically an interface so that we're building an application that other applications can talk to, but there's no user interface. It's just exchanging data back and forth between our application and another application. So we say at the top, first of all, which type we want, and then that checkbox at the bottom said include. We had the option to include some folders, like the file structure, for the selected type. Or we could say, leave that all blank, and we just get a totally blank solution. Okay.
Which one do we click on when we get the project? Which file?
Click File, New Project,
Yeah.
ASP.NET Web Application,
Yes.
and then choose Empty Web Application at the top, and click the Web Forms checkbox. So we should get this set up. We have our web.config file, which has our site configuration, which won't really have much in it. We get a global ASAX, which is any global code we want running, which is also basically blank, has a application start method with no code in it. So if there's any initialization code we want to happen every time our application gets started, we could put it in here.
Sorry, how'd you get that on the right side?
If you don't see this on the right side, that panel, it's the Solution Explorer. You'll notice along the right-hand panel and along the left, there's a bunch of windows. You can toggle all of these. Anything that you're missing is available through the View menu. So if you don't see Solution Explorer here, if you click on the View menu, Solution Explorer is the fourth item in that list. And I've just set mine to auto show and hide. If I want to keep it here, I can just click this little pin, and now it will stay here. But as I'm coding, so that it'll just disappear, if I choose auto hide, to get it back, I just have to click on it. I find this is easier because it will show me more of this code window. We can see more of the code at a time when I have the auto hide function on. And if you're using the lab computers, we want to turn the line numbers on. They're off by default. And the way you turn them on is under Tools. And right down at the bottom is Options. When you click Tools and Options, this little window pops up. It defaults here to the first section that says Environment General. If I just close that up and go down to the fourth element, which says Text Editor, inside of Text Editor, there's an option that says All Languages. And here's the line number checkbox in the middle under Settings. You'll just want to enable that. Again, if you're on your own computer, you probably did this already, and you probably have the line numbers already set. Only if you're on the lab computer will you want to turn that on. So if you don't have Visual Studio set up yet, you might want to flip on the lab computer because it already has the application.
I have a question. Like, where's the IT office on this level? Because I tried to email the guy to help my dreams spark so I can download the program.
It's in B228. It's the last office on the other side of the hall by the glass doors, by the stairs. But yep, but he's on holiday this week. He'll be back. He'll be back next week. But I will show you that because I know several people wanted their DreamSpark to be restored. You actually should be able to reset it yourself. I'll show you how to do it.
Did I forget my password?
I know. There's an option on here that will let you reset it yourself. So if you go from the DreamSpark homepage, if you go into the DreamSpark for Students area, it's this orange and red panel on the left.
Okay.
If I just click one of these links, go into the download section. If you go to the sign-in link, I know you don't have your password, but I think there's a forget password, and I had some students in my other class go through this on Wednesday, and they said it worked. So if you go to sign in, I'm already signed in. There is a button here. There is a forget password button. So if you say forget your password and you put in your student email, it will send you a password, should send you a password reset link. You did it, Carlin?
Yeah.
And it worked okay?
Yep.
Yeah.
I had to get the key so I could restart it.
Right, okay. So you should be able to, if you click on forget password on the sign-in screen, it should send you the password to your student email, and then you can reset it.
So you go into the orange box, I guess.
Yeah, and then click sign in. And on the sign in page, there should be a forget password link.
So even if you don't know your profile name, you should be fine.
You should be. You should just be able to provide your student email.
So it's just a student email.
If you still can't get in, then you can go see Greg next week, but he's on holiday this week. He'll be back on Monday. Okay, so what we want to do is add a default page to our solution. So in my Solution Explorer here, I'm going to select my project, and I'll right-click it and choose Add. So what we want is a web form. You may see web form in this list, you may not. The list always brings up the 5 most recently added items. So you can either choose web form from here, or you can scroll right up to the top and just choose new item if you're not seeing web form. And it will bring up this list, and web form should be probably the 4th one in the list. So over on the left it will say web, Visual C# web, and we want a web form. This will create a new ASPX page, and I'm just going to call it default. And then I'll click the add button, and Visual Studio should create a new file with an HTML template for us. So it looks pretty much like a regular HTML page. We just have a couple of, basically we have this run at equals server tag and this declaration at the top about where the code for this page will live. So I'll just put on a title, I'm going to open up a copy as well of the little one-page site we did last week, just so we can get an idea of what we did. We basically made a little mini calculator. So we were working with basically 3 kinds of controls last week. We worked with a text box, a label, and a button, right, where a user could enter a couple of values. So here's what we had last week. So we played around actually 4 controls: labels, literals, buttons, and text boxes. So we had one button that would go away when we clicked it and would copy our text into a label, and we had a second one that would copy it into a literal. So we want to work today with some of the list controls. I mean, we'll use text boxes and labels a lot, but we want to play around with some of the other controls in the toolbox. So let's see what we've got here. I'll put on a label. We'll create a drop-down list. We'll put in some country names. So last week when we were working, just a regular label. This will just be static. So when we worked last week, we put a bunch of these ASP controls on our page, and I suggested using these 3-character prefixes is a good idea. So we prefixed our labels with LBL, our text boxes with TXT, our buttons with BTN. So that way when we are in our code window, if I wanted to refer to any text box, I could start typing TX, and Visual Studio would recognize and bring up all the text boxes. So typically for drop-down lists, I'm going to give them DDL prefixes. So we can look at how one of these works. So we're going to use a server control that will generate an HTML select tag, but we want to use, just like last week we were using the server-side controls like text boxes and buttons, we'll want to use a server-side drop-down list. So we can either just type the tag ourselves, or we can get it out of the toolbox. If you don't have this toolbox icon on the left, you can turn it on through the View menu. Just click on View, and Toolbox will be right down near the bottom here. Turn it on. So what we want is a drop-down list. So I'm just going to drag one of these onto the page. And Visual Studio will automatically assign it an ID and add the run at equals server. So I want to take out this ID. It's not very descriptive. I'll call it DDL country. Now, most of the time when we use these drop-down lists, we're going to be filling them from a database query in our table. Today, we're just going to hard code in the options so we can see at least how it works. So if I open a tag, we really only have two choices, and you can probably figure out which of these tags we're going to use. Right? We'll want the smart tag, so we'll choose an ASP list item tag. The nice thing about the ASP list item is we use this same tag for any kind of list control. So it could be a drop-down, could be a list of checkboxes, or a list of radio buttons. We use the same tag for putting options into any one of those lists. So we have a couple of properties we can set. So we can connect it directly to a database here if we want to. We're not going to do that today. But we can set a value property, we can set a text property, we can choose if the option is enabled or disabled, and we can also set one option to be selected, so we can make that a default. Why would we have both text and value properties? Why wouldn't we just have one of those?
Sometimes it's numeric value instead of a text string.
Right, because very often our values might represent IDs in the database. We don't want to show our users a list of ID numbers because that isn't going to be meaningful, right? So for example, if I wanted to have a drop-down of students, I want the text property of the drop-down to show your first name and last name, but the value is probably going to store your student ID number. So if I pick one, we'll use that as the value. So we have access to both of these. So what we'll do is let's set out some text properties. We'll put a few countries in, but we'll assign a shortened value for each one. So maybe the first one, we'll put in a value of CA. We'll add another item. Where else? What other countries in the class are people from? We've got Canada. I know Rachel's from Korea, so we can put in maybe KO. What else should we add to the list? China? Any others we need to add? I missed anybody? Have we got the whole class? So after our drop down, let's add a button on here. We'll add an ASP button. We'll call it BTN Show Country. And it's going to be a server-side control, so we'll add the run at equals server attribute to it. We can set the text property. Now I'll show you the other way. What we want to do is we're going to want to add some C# code onto the button, so when the user clicks it, we can print a message to the screen that will read the selected country from our drop-down. So we'll need an ASP label to print that out. So I showed you last week one way we could do that is we could go into design view and double click our button. That's an option. I'm going to show you the other way we could do it instead. So from in here, if I type onClick equals, Visual Studio will prompt me, okay, well there's already a page load in the C#, so we could write code there, or we have the option to create a new event when the button gets clicked. So we'll choose that. I'll choose create new event. and it writes the code for me when the button is clicked, and it now adds this click method into our C#. So this is doing the same thing as if we went into design view and double clicked the button. That's how we did it last week. So we can achieve this either way.
Is there any way to achieve that without the prompt coming up when we start typing it in? It's like, are we able to...
You could, yeah, you could just manually type it all in yourself, but why would you? I've yet to see a good
I mean,
reason.
more so for like opening up the window without having to actually like type the line in and then say create new.
The other way you could do it, let me see here. In design view, if you open the properties button, you may be able to do it here. No, actually, you can't. There's an on client click, but that's a JavaScript event that happens on in the browser.
Okay. So we're kind of a slave to the program on that.
Actually, sorry, here, yes, you can do it. There's a little lightning bolt icon that says events. If you click that, you can then set the event through there. Normally, just jumping into design view and double clicking the object is the easiest, but I almost never am in the design view. I'm always in the code window, so I can just start typing the on click and I'll just choose new event. So what we want to have happen, here's our page. I'm just going to compile my site and we'll get it started just so it loads in the browser. It's not going to really do anything yet. So if we choose to start the application without debugging, under the debug menu, this will launch a new port. So here's our drop down. At the moment, clicking our button doesn't do anything. If we look at the HTML that gets rendered from our ASP dropdown and ASP list item tags, it just renders as straight HTML. So as far as the end user is concerned, we just used a select box and option tags the way we did in PHP. We didn't actually use server-side tags. But this is going to behave differently. Notice what happens when I click the button and submit the page. You'll notice that something's different than if we just put regular HTML on here. How's it different? Kenzie? It is reloading, but what happens to the drop-down? Here, why don't I try this? Let me grab this. I'm going to grab this HTML. I'll put an HTML-only version on.
It persists. It's like whatever the select.
Right. If I choose Korea and refresh my page, my drop-down is sticky. My option's still there because it's an ASP, it's a smart control. If we put on, so I'll just put on a straight HTML version with the same values. So now I've got two, but if I pick Korea in both, what's going to happen when I submit the page? Will the drop downs be the same or are they going to be different? How are they going to be different, Mackenzie? Okay, so what's each drop down going to say when I click the button? Okay, well, yeah, so which value will be selected here when I reload the page? Right, the top one's going to say Korea. What do you think the bottom one's going to say? Okay, so what options are going to show in the second drop down? Right. So this one doesn't persist because it's just standard HTML, right? So it's always going to default back to the first choice. So even though to the end user these look identical, the only difference is they have different names and IDs. They're still select tags with options. They're going to behave differently. So this one persists, and this one gets reset back every time. So to me, this is always going to be a better choice, because we might want to let the user pick something here, submit our page, and maybe they then want to pick another option. Well, at least they can see what they've already chosen. The list doesn't automatically get set back. So I'm going to take this one out. We don't really need that one. So now what I'm going to do above here is maybe just put a label on. Put on an ASP label, and I'll call it LBL country. So when the user clicks the button, we want to print a message into this label that indicates what country they picked. So this is pretty similar to what we did last week, except last week we were reading a value from a text box. Today we want to read the value out of the drop-down list instead, which is similar to how we do it from a text box, but not exactly the same. So we'll add one of these. Really doesn't matter where you put the label, it's just going to print a message to the page. So if we put it here, that message will appear before the drop-down list. If I were to put it down here, it would appear after. So it doesn't really matter where this goes. So we've already written a click method. So now we just want to go into our C# window and add a bit of code onto our button click. So Visual Studio already wrote this function for us. So we just want to print a message into that label that will include some static text as well as the selection. Vache?
Sorry, how did you bring that into that page again? You have to double-click.
If you go into, well, you can do it two ways. You can go into design view, so you don't see any code, you actually see the page, and you can double click the button. That will do it for you. So again, this is where our little prefix for the controls helps. If I type LBL, there's only one object on the page that starts with the characters LBL. So we'll choose our country label. So the first part of our message will say you selected. So now if we want to append on, unlike in PHP where for some strange reason we would use a dot to concatenate strings, we can actually use a plus sign in C#, which makes a lot more sense, I think. So how can we read the country that the user picked? Which object on the page, we've got 4 objects basically, which one of them holds the country choice? Yep, so it's the list items within our drop-down list, right? So our drop-down list, we gave it an ID of DDL country. So DDL country. And when I hit the dot, we get a list of all the properties and methods of that drop-down list. So we have to figure out which property we want. Because notice each option has both a value and a text. So which one of these do you think? We've got a whole bunch of selected properties. You think selected item? Well, even within selected item, so that gives us the whole option. So that is the option the user picked. And now we can access either the text or the value. This is one of the other benefits of the ASP drop-down list. that HTML dropdowns don't have. When we use an HTML dropdown, we can only access the value, so the hidden part of the option. On the next page, we can't access the text. With an ASP dropdown, we actually have access to both. So if we want to display the full country name, we would pick the selected item .text. We'll try it that way, and then we can change it to show the value instead. So we've added code in our C#, so we'll have to click on the build menu and compile our solution to get this function added into our code. So if we reload it, now it'll give us the country name, and our drop-down is sticky. If we wanted to show the 2-character country abbreviation instead, we can just, rather than output the text property, if you ever want to bring that little window back up, all you have to do is highlight or delete the dot and hit the dot again, and that will always bring that little context menu back up. So I can either highlight it, or if I delete it, I can just put it back and double click. So if we want the value instead, this should give us that 2-character abbreviation. In fact, I don't even have to refresh it. I can just resubmit, and now it'll show me the value rather than the text.
I think the text gives me the value.
Sorry, Brandon, can you say that again?
When I type, so it's like on the C# page.
Yep.
I have DDL country.text, and it's giving me the value instead.
So you've used .text, not dot. So here, I'll go back.
Oh, dot selected item.
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the other nice things is this little gray window. If I choose a property here and click on it once, notice to the left I get this little gray description. So it describes what the text property does. It says it gets or sets the selected value property. So text will show you the value that was selected. If you want the actual full text, you have to choose selected item.text. We could also set any one of these as the default value. So let's say we want to make China. When our page loads, we want our drop-down to default to China, because that's going to be maybe what most of our users are going to pick. So in my list item, we can just set selected equals true. So now when I load the page the first time, China's pre-selected in that list.
You make one where it just has select showing. So you
And we'll make that the default choice? Sure. So I'll ask you, how would we do it? If we want an option at the top,
just create a value above Canada. The value is
sure.
select and text is select.
Yep, so we can set the value equal to,
SEL.
sure. Or we could just set it to that, meaning it's empty, perhaps. So I'll take out the selected equals true on. So instead, when our page loads, we'll have an option at the top that says select instead. So we could certainly do it that way. And often we do, right? And then we can add some validation to make sure if that field's going to be required. We can add a check that when the user submits the button, that our drop-down doesn't say select. How would we do that? Well, we'll get into this probably later today, but here's a clue. If I close up the standard controls and go into the validation controls, they give us a whole bunch of validators. So we can use one of those. to make sure.
Can you get the same results by doing, let's say, the whatever LBL variable dot text equals you live in plus the label, not the label name, but the drop down list ID,
Yep.
and then dot text.
Yes, so there's a few different ways. So that's what actually Brandon had done. So if you choose, there's 3 equivalents. There's 3 properties, they're all the same. I'll write them all out so you can see they'll all give us the same.
But I meant without the selected item part of it.
Yes, yes, I know. Just bear with me. I'm going to show you. So all of these 3 properties are equivalent. So there's a selected value property and there's a text property.
Oh.
Those 3 will all give you the value of whichever option the user picks. So you can use any one of these.
There's no really right or wrong.
No, they're basically three different ways of accessing that same value. Okay, so this is probably the shortest. In fact, I've never used that one before, so thank you for teaching me something new. I've always used this one, selected value to get the value, and to get the actual text, the friendly text, you have to use selected item.text. So I didn't realize, I knew these 2 were equivalent. I didn't know this was also equivalent. So you can use all of them, they'll all give you the same result. I'll maybe put a message in my content. So you could use any one of those. I think from now on I'll use this one because I'm in favor of less typing, not more. So those will all do the same thing. So to access the text, whoops, instead. So basically you can use .selectItem.text if you want the full text, and you can use just the .text property if you want the value. So the way that this is helpful would be, let's say we had a drop down that looks something like this. I'll just put on another one. We'll take a break in a minute. So I might use the value of so I want my drop-down to show student names, but when I'm saving a choice, what I actually need to store is the student ID. So I'll just copy this for a minute. So I want to access the value property. I'll get to your question in just one second. I want to access the value property for the purpose of saving the user's choice to the database, but maybe I want to print a confirmation on the screen or send an email. Well, in that case, showing the end user the ID number, we need the ID number for our own coding purposes, but showing the user an ID number, that may not be meaningful. We want to print out the friendly text that they chose. So I want to print out on the screen the student's name, but I want to save their student ID. In PHP, if this is a regular dropdown, when we post to the server, we only have access to the values. We no longer have access to the text properties. Whereas with an ASP dropdown list, we still have access to show both or use both the value and the friendly text, which saves us a lot of work. Matt, you had a question?
I was just wondering, is there a shortcut to comment out stuff?
Yes. You should see these on the toolbar. This is comment and uncomment. So if I want to uncomment those, all I have to do is highlight them, uncomment. I want to comment that whole section. Click comment.
Control K.
Yes, you can also, sorry, I never use the shortcut keys, so
It's that one,
yeah, Control K, and then Control C will make a comment, Control K and Control U will uncomment. So if you're more of a keyboard shortcut kind of user, you have those shortcuts. I just prefer clicking the mouse on the toolbar. The other nice thing about using these list items is when we're working with radio buttons or checkbox lists, which is what we'll do after the break, we use these same list items and we have the same properties, reading the text or value from radio buttons or checkbox lists. So we'll play around with both of those after 9 o'clock. I'll leave this code up, and why don't we take a 10-minute break here? We'll come back at 9:05.